Thank you, Joan, I think. You've made what was already an unenviable task, which is to try to bring today to some kind of conclusion, all the more unenviable because to go from such level of specificity to the kind of generalities that we'll have to produce something for which I can really only apologize. You know, I think it's a little dastardly to put the keynote at the end, which is to say to ask us to end somehow with a projective reflection on a day of reflections, to try to, I suppose it's a way of asking us to think about what can we do with all of these really fascinating things that we've heard, and where do we go with them, and as was being said earlier today, what do we actually do with them? And I suppose it's really another way to ask Peter's question for the students here today, which is, where are the big guns, and how do you find ways to resist them? And I can't really help but to say to Peter, no one is fooled, even by a moment, by your decision not to join us at the table. That it's not very good camouflage, and we all know that on some level you are the big gun, at least as the evidence today. If we could do a search, which somebody will instantly be able to do for me, which name was repeated the most often, it would have been yours, I believe. We can make information up, I think we were told. But I would say very seriously that I think that the difficulty now is that you defined a certain model of resistance, and it's very hard to resist the resistor. And I suppose on some level that's maybe your most diabolical gift to the future. So that being said, I thought maybe I could try to pose some questions to the panel about what I thought of as the three areas of concern that emerge from today that are the most productive, to my mind, for future work. They maybe were not the most important then, but I think that they're the issues that emerge with the greatest, shall we say, salience for today. So the first, I thought that if we were to try to characterize the collective effort of today, what we would see was an effort to begin, not to originate, but to move forward the project of moving history away from a genealogy of architects and towards a history of institutions. And I suppose for me that raised certain kinds of questions, which I will ask you all in a moment. Questions like, can you perform institutional critique from within the institution? How do we deal with this nexus of institutions? It's really quite extraordinary how stable the cast of institutions were that we looked at today, how little room there seemed in the 1960s with all of its openness and void, that we're really describing a pretty small number of places, interconnected, and so forth. And how do we, in effect, manage this shift from the history of architects to the history of ideas? The second question that I thought was relevant, maybe for our discussion, was a question about, or a comment about the academy, both of and in the archive. It was tremendously fascinating to receive a kind of avalanche of paper from Stanford's own archive, and then to see more of it being produced today. And I suppose I would say that what we saw today was not paper architecture, but the paperwork of architecture, and the paperwork of producing histories of architecture. And we saw architects with their own forms of paperwork. And I'm beginning now to think that the manila envelope, the manila folder, the tab, and the index card is really going to turn out to be that which binds us all together. It's the material of interdisciplinarity clarity as we saw it unfolding today. And we might ask ourselves then, what is our own paperwork? What does it look like in the post paper age? What does the academy look like? How do we produce knowledge and so forth? I will just say that there is something both fascinating and a little bit scary about this paperwork. One was how quickly we seemed to have extracted the same tidbits. We heard a couple of stories again and again, so we saw over the course of really just a few hours, little surprising tidbits in the archive become the kernels of what we might call a new origin story. I also think that those pieces of paperwork betray certain paper that talk about the disempowerment of the architect with their connections to the mayor and to the this and the that. If we added up all the cost of travel and so forth, I would say that there was certainly a kind of power in that paperwork that might be interesting to think about in relation to the academy today, how it's funded, and how it exercises power. The last area I thought that I found particularly interesting was the question of the relationship between technology and information, or technology and the production of knowledge. Although nobody spoke about it explicitly in these terms, we did see the evidence of the transformation, the technological transformation of tools in the practice of architecture. And by practice, I mean very largely the practice of the historian, the theorist, the critic, the architect, the professional architect, and so forth. So clearly, this was an era of tape recorders, or we wouldn't have had these tapes, although nobody quite knew what to do with them, ergo they got lost. Helicopters were apparently a big part of the architectural technologies. Slides were a very big part of all of this. So I would say that this is part of the technology of our field. And, so somebody said to me earlier, we were looking at some picture, well, this was before the era of selfies. No, actually, I would say this was the era of selfies. This is the beginning of the selfies. That's why we have all of those blow-dry jobs that we were looking at with great fascination. The way you look at kittens on the internet. But there was a difference, which was in the way that those documents were disseminated, which is to say that they came out of a Pandora's box, and today we had the moment of discovery. Well, we learned with the microphone today that there will be no moment of discovery because this is all being broadcast immediately. It's constant. I don't know exactly where we go in this total capturing of everything. I suppose, Reinhold, I would just say to you, you were a little nudgy about the photographs of the parties. Except I think that somewhere there's a generational shift maybe in here, which is that one used to think that the parties were precisely where the great ideas were exchanged, never on the stage. But now they're all photographed and captured, so there is no space outside of this technology. So at any rate, the question of institutional histories, the production of archives, their immediacy, and their modes of dissemination in the contemporary academy, the relationship between technology and information seem to me to be points of real tension, let's say, between the era of Case and the contemporary and the contemporary moment. And I'm sure that we all deal with these as we deal with students and our own academies and so forth. I know Tony, who is maybe the one person who hasn't had the stage, has some things to say about broadening this institutional history a bit, and I'll hand it over to you and ask you to.
Well, the question of institutional history is always hard because one is always part of that institutional history, right? So I'll come to that in a minute. I was not a member of Case. I was adopted by this slightly dysfunctional family at the age of 19 when I first met Peter Eisenman, who, as a teaching assistant in Cambridge, took over from Sandy Wilson the first year studio and taught me how to do Japanese detailing, wood detailing, and shoji screens. I still have the most beautiful photographs of the impeccable models that he forced me to make, and the impeccable drawings that he forced me to do with a ruling pen, just like Paul Rudolph, as he said. So I want to say one very personal thing, and then some institutional things. First, I want to say that almost everybody in CASE, as somebody myself coming in, I suppose, as a silver, in 1964-65, has been extremely generous to me. I owe to at least, if not more than 3 people in this room, certainly to 3 people in this room, an enormous debt in relationship to my architectural education and the continuation of it. If I'd been talking about history, if this had been a historian convention, I'd have to talk about my debt to Carl Shorsky, to Raymond Williams, to Ronald Gray, and to Cambridge and to Princeton historians. If I'd been talking about politics, I'd have to talk about my debt to a lot of my contemporaries, T.J. Clark at Cambridge and the quasi-situationist group there, where we read Althusser and Marx and became very, very acutely aware of the crisis of capital and civilization. But if I talk about architecture, it has to be that meeting Peter Eisenman in a very active way in Cambridge in 1960, together probably the same day as I met Colin Rowe. I have to give this one anecdote, because I do have to say that Peter learned a great deal at Cambridge. I was sitting in Leslie Martin's first lecture. He gave the theory lecture at Cambridge, and at the end of Sandy Wilson's little perfect brutalist auditorium in Scroop Terrace, I was sitting in the back next to a short man with tan pants and a crew cut who was going all the time. And Leslie had stood up with flowing white hair at the podium and was just about to start when in the room came another figure walking up the aisle, going, stopped in front of the podium and said, "Hi, I'm Peter Eisenman." And Leslie Martin very gracefully said, "Not now, dear boy, not now." And Colin Rowe turned to me and said, Who is that strange little American boy with the white socks?" So this was that, but I do know that Peter learned a great deal at Cambridge because I had to proofread his thesis 3 years later, which was a trauma of sorts. Colin Rowe, I met the second day when I unfortunately telephoned him at 9 o'clock in the morning. And a voice echoing from the depths of the phone said, Who? Oh, never before noon. Only Mozart will wake me up. So, for 2 years with Colin Rowe, at once a week for the approved hour and then a lot of disapproved hours of martinis afterwards, I met and learned about the 18th century. It was, of course, in 1965 that another phone call at 7 o'clock in the morning came to me from a voice that was very familiar, but I hadn't heard for 2 years, saying, "Well, you know, I'm now in Princeton." I said, "Yes, Peter." And I said, "Well, we got this project." I said, "Yes, we're going to design a city between Boston and Washington. It's going to be straight." And I said, "Oh, really, Peter?" He said, "Yeah, you want to come help design it?" And I said, "Well, maybe, Peter." He said, "Well, I got you a job. Half-time instructorship, you're teaching with Charlie Gaffney, and half-time working with me and Michael. Okay? You're here in June, right?" So that was me. I came for a year to Princeton and stayed a little longer. But at Princeton, a year before, had come Ken Frampton. He's the second person in this room to whom I owe an enormous amount. It was Kenneth who first turned me to the idea of serious research and development of my historical understandings. I'd come up to Cambridge as a historian, and I was a nascent historian. And so Kenneth was doing a seminar on 1900 to the present, which was then 65. And he suggested, said, well, you should do, the thing before, like when it all starts, why not 1750? Then you could come to 1900 and we could, say hello. So, so that was the beginning of another me, right? If me was in architecture was Peter, me in the sort of criticism and theory and writing was Roe, plus martinis, then me with Kenneth was definitely a scholarship. And Kenneth very gracefully at some point allowed us to teach together on Le Corbusier, and we developed together a program of teaching which at the point when Kenneth left became a nascent PhD program in a number of areas, and I owe an enormous amount to Kenneth. Then, having not been able to get myself, after Peter left Princeton, to talk to him for at least 2 years, those 7 o'clock phone calls, really. I had a family, I had to work, I had to get up in the morning. The 7 o'clock phone calls were just too much. So I knew that if I called him, he'd call back, so I didn't for 2 years. Then, out of the blue, 1970, 71, I got a call. Hi. Peter, hello. We're doing this conference on education. You want to come? Well, what do you want me to do? Just come here. Come on, talk. We're doing this conference on education. We're having a Cooper Union thing. We've got a big exhibition, the MoMA thing. Just come and talk. We've got a lot of people, George Baird, all these people. You're going to love it. So I said, fine, Peter, thank you very much. And so I wrote a piece for that, which then became the first piece that was published in Oppositions. Oppositions actually was not until the 5th issue of Oppositions, or the 6th issue of, it's the 6th issue of Oppositions, when I got another phone call. Peter, hi. Peter, you want to be an editor of Oppositions? Do you need one? Don't you have 3 or 4? Yeah, but come, it's okay, it's about time. I said, okay. So I did 6, and then, Joan, I do have to disabuse you of one thing. The Institute was not responsible for the special issue on the École des Beaux-Arts. I take perfect and absolute responsibility for that issue. Peter read none of the text of the École des Beaux-Arts issue. If he had, we probably wouldn't have published it. So this was an issue which was pointed for myself, having worked with Tafuri and his friends for a long time then, for myself, a way to sort of disembowel this sort of extraordinary fetishism of the École des Beaux-Arts drawing as being the Paris, as being the inception of something, and to introduce Viollet-le-Duc, introduce theory, introduce styles, introduce all the questions that troubled the Beaux-Arts, all the counter-Beaux-Arts forces in Paris in the 19th century, as a way of countering on its own terms, if you like, the MoMA issue. So I don't think it represented quite the historicization of the Institute as a whole. I just don't think it did. I think it was just one issue of Oppositions. After that, Kenneth did an extraordinary 2 issues on Corbusier, and Oppositions went on. But in the Institute, the third individual that I have to honor this afternoon is Stan Anderson, because Stan was always there, and especially during the Streets project, where I was sort of seconded to do some research into streets. Stan was someone who encouraged me, was patient with me, held up publication for me, until I had finished this extraordinarily long and tortuous essay on the street, and published it. And so for that, and for his sort of sense of nurturing the career of a young writer, I have to thank him today. So those 3 I thank. In terms of the questions that Sylvia asked, I'm very excited by the fact that institutions, individuals, groups of PhD students are doing this sort of massive, post-Coolhouse scanning of data, of archives, and so on. I was asked the other day at a little conference at the Storefront, who just produced another archive book, another big, heavy book that you can't read with either, not with one hand in bed, but not with two hands in bed, Last night I tried to read the MIT book. I was sort of trying to read Stan Anderson's article in the MIT book, and I fell asleep and it fell on me. And I have to say, I woke up very sharply. It fell in the wrong place. Anyway, I have to say that when I looked at the atlas, when I look at Rem's scanning and interviews of the metabolist, when I look at the MIT book, when I look at Clip, Stamp, and Fold, when I look at the work that Sylvia has done in relationship to LA archives, I have to say that they're incredibly important as a first stage of the kind of history that we're talking about. First of all, they reveal to all our students, they stop us from having to scan all those articles, that's the first thing. Secondly, they reveal a density of understanding and discourse behind all the things that are in the secondary sources, the survey books, and so on and so forth, which nobody had ever revealed before. And thirdly, for historians like ourselves who are trying to go more deeply into, and more, if you like, both micro and macro historically into the field, it gives us a reminder of things that we've forgotten, of things that we never knew, of things we really have to go and look at. So for that, I think the archive scanning and the different kinds of institution, whether they're written by the institution or not itself, I think are extremely important to us as historians and to PhD programs in general. That's all I have to say.
Do you, this is a question I'm going to start with you, but then I wonder whether others here on the panel would address this. Somebody said earlier today, it might have been you, Peter, I don't remember, but somebody said very emphatically that case couldn't happen today. And I wonder whether, first of all, you think it's true that it couldn't happen today, and secondly, if it could or it couldn't, should it happen again?
Well, I was going to say should. I mean, it seems to me that that all these reunions of reunions, and I have to say here, I'm not revisiting Case because I'm visiting Case for the first time. I never knew about Case until it had happened, actually. But the sense I have is that Case itself, as the kind of position taking that was both necessary and possible at that time. Why should it happen? I mean, why? Of course, it couldn't happen today, but something similar might. If there were a possibility of, and this is where I think the question of resistance, the question of where resistance goes, Peter's question that everything is okay, or everything is there, or there's so much there that you don't know where or how to resist it. I think there have been minor resistances in the last 10, 15, 20 years. There have been the Luddite resistances to computerization. There have been the acceptances of computerization and the resistances to old forms of design practice. There have been resistances, such as the resistances, very salutary resistances that those like Kenneth have forwarded in relationship to localities and regionalities and also tectonics. And I think now there are certain resistances to the extraordinary prolific and very unthoughtful proliferation of parametric curvatures. And I think, that there are certain, I mean, that's a mnemonic for a whole way of architecture. But so there are these small resistances, whether or not there could be a a resistance that gathers. How many people were in case all the time at one moment? What was the largest number of architects? 20? 25? Whether you could get 25 architects in different parts of a country, or whether a country is the right mode, certainly, I mean, there are certain conversations like this that happen on the web very, very seriously. The whole response to the, for example, there's a tearing down of iconic monuments of brutalism that emerged very, very spontaneously, first in Britain and then across the world, has had a major effect on both rehabilitation and the preservation of certain of objects in a way that nothing could have stopped Penn Station being demolished. That's a negative operation, but in projective operations, why not? Yeah, I mean.
Well, maybe this is can ask Joan to speculate about this in relation to a way that you were describing the early history of the Institute, which had something to do with, or reflecting back on case, I don't remember exactly in what context the formulation came, but about a sort of a dispersed set of architects looking for a program, looking for a project, I understood this to be part of your narrative that was leading towards a kind of consolidation, which I understood the story that you were telling to point towards. I suppose I was thinking in terms of contemporary technologies through which these conversations would take place, and contemporary platforms and so forth. They do have a tendency, I think, to erode consolidation and to keep things dispersed and move away from program finding, or do you think that they do?
I don't necessarily think they do. I think they do both. I think that social networks today also coalesce movements and groups and groupuscles. I think we're seeing a lot of that in our field and every other one today by virtue of new media. And what I was suggesting apropos of case vis-a-vis Team 10 or vis-a-vis any of the kind of polemical alliances that have formed in the history of architecture, that the ones that have seemed to be most viable have been motivated by a project, by a program, rather than just a kind of desire for a structure, for a formal kind of getting together. I mean, that's the way institutions like, say, the AIA came about. I mean, there was a need at a certain moment for, a professional organization of architects, and so there were meetings that started taking place in the middle of the 19th century, and, little by little, they got it off the ground. That's one way that these organizations form. But another one is when they're really genuinely responding to have an antagonist that they, that is motivating the formation, and that led to Team 10 certainly. In the case of Siam, I mean, they had this patron and, Madame de Mondreau, who was, but there was a kind of moment when modern architecture was no longer just marginal, not just peripheral, or wanted to be, only avant-garde. It wanted now to be mainstream, and that was Le Corbusier's project, to kind of pull it out of the kind of, milieu of a kind of Dada or some avant-garde and make it the big thing. And for that you needed backing, you need funding, you needed a network, you needed all that stuff. But it was foddered by, again, an attack on on academicism. I think that, there's a vague, diffuse desire one senses in the early 60s for something that's lacking, particularly lacking in an American context, and a nostalgia. I mean, Tafori's reading of, that the American so-called avant-garde or neo-avant-garde of the 60s is a nostalgia for something it never had, namely that, avant-garde moment in the 20s. So, and I think Peter's project kind of comes out of that, but other people that are part of this group and its kind of regional factions, I think, didn't share that at all, and the kind of breakup along American versus European Europhile lines was a kind of sign of that. So I think there are, a variety of motivations, but I don't see any reason, or any lack of kind of formations today. I think we have more of them, in fact, than
But I guess I suppose that was my question a little bit. One might argue that the silvers and the whites and the grays are all shades of the same color, and that today the Prismacolor set is well, I mean, it's vastly proliferated, abetted by all kinds of things and for all kinds of reasons. And so I just wonder whether the model of resistance that we've been talking about and so forth presupposes a kind of centrality of discourse or a centralization of discourse that maybe these very technologies undermine. And
think of Occupy. I mean, as soon as there's a grievance that can be, formulated and articulated, then it can lead to, I don't think that I think there's more, diversity than ever now, and at the same time, there is more centralization. I mean, I think we've got both these things at the same time.
Maybe I could shift to Ken and Stanford in two very different ways. Stanford, you've been now for a long time at one of the great centers of technological research. And I wonder whether you have any reflections to share sort of beyond case, maybe beginning with the period of case. There was some reference made to the early interest in computation and so forth, about the way architecture is produced at a school that's so intimately connected with technology of a certain kind.
I think it's a rather strange history. One of the things I've long thought about the School of Architecture at MIT is that, it started when I first was here, and for quite a number of years we were still an undergraduate school, and that meant that every fall there would be whatever it is, 5,000 or 6,000 students come. All of them are adept at mathematics and physics and chemistry, and they were the best in their class, and they got it from their small high schools to MIT precisely on those strengths. They get here and they find out there are 5,000 or 6,000 of those, and maybe I'm not the top anymore. And they start looking around about what are other things, and then some of them find architecture, and they find architecture as something that is not science and technology. Now, of course, with graduate admissions, it's a little different, but nevertheless, now we get graduate admissions from schools that are not technically oriented. So when I became head of the department, 1991, I guess, yes, 1991, we had 2 Mac 128s and a couple of graduate students who knew how to use them. And I said, somehow we have to, the other schools were already moving. And I didn't have any colleagues to talk to about how you would move. So I convinced Bill Mitchell to come down from Harvard and chair a committee at MIT to start to think about how we would enter into the computer world. And even then, therefore it started as a kind of confrontational thing, that there was still an old MIT ethos, which I had grown up with and in many ways believed in, and didn't want to kill. I wanted to complement it, but it really was a confrontation between the established ethos and the new that was coming in. And of course, it's now changed. Just the whole, I guess, there's probably no school of architecture that isn't totally dominated by computation, but we're not in any way distinguished. So I don't think that at least the overt business of computation in schools of architecture has made a great deal of difference. But are we in any way more related to the other technological developments here? And I don't think I can claim that. I think the School of Architecture here is probably very much like schools of architecture elsewhere.
Well, I was trying to, in some way, figure out what the points of pressure that we could apply to the sense that there had been a void. I mean, I think that one of the things that is the most remarkable about today is the sense that there was a void that was filled up by a whole lot of conversation, which today we seem to be turning into biographical reminiscence, which would be, as wonderful and entertaining and productive as it would be in some way to undermine the very purpose of all of that original conversation. So to try to, find some points where today we might find voids or excesses and so forth seems to me important, because I suppose I have to commit the sin of reminiscing here just for a moment. But one of the things that I find very difficult when I look to the generation senior to me, and I suppose, Peter, you're really the first amongst equals in this regard, is that you all have been incredibly generous to younger scholars and younger people. At least when you sort of grew up after the 60s, you were supposed to have resistance towards your elders, and yet your elders here were always very generous and accommodating to youth culture. So to end the day without a sense that there is a new project seems to me to be very undermining to the very project that you set forward. So I understand if my questions are not immediately nostalgic, but related to these things, but it's hard for me not to imagine that the real key issues are thinking about technology in all of its transformative capacity today, that's both the void and the center. And to think that there's not a particular history of architecture in relation to technology at MIT, which you know perfectly well because you have a 12,000-pound book that just began to discover it, or I was going to then turn to Ken, because in fact I would agree with you that the way the entry of technology into architecture was staged at Columbia is really very different than it was here. And thinking about the big infrastructure of information technology versus the formal curlicues of the paperless studio, which you both witnessed and at very close hand, seems to me to be really the point zero for the new generation that we're, I think, hoping to make case useful for in some way. I don't know, Ken, I mean, where were you? Were you in the paperless studios? Or where was your paper?
Yeah. MIT before you go. Yeah. Nicholas Negroponte and the Architecture Machine Group, that happened at MIT. In fact, I chaired Nicholas Negroponte's tenure committee and got to preserve his career here. But it grew up within the Department of Architecture, but it became an elephant in itself. And after a certain time, again, it was under my headship, shortly thereafter, that we just sat down and decided it was too big to be contained in the Department of Architecture. It was defining a different agenda, and it moved off to become the Media Lab. Now, to the credit of the people who've been hitting the school recently, now the Media Labs, instead of being rather privatized and closing out the architecture department, there is much more collaboration between them. So there's something to come together where they have pushed forward in the technological world, but they've also pushed forward in such a way that it has in many ways opened in recent years. And so we may be moving to a point where they are actually somewhat integrated again.
Well, Bernard, of course, I better have my
Yeah.
Yes. Well, it is, of course, Bernard Schumi that brings about the paperless studio in Columbia. And I didn't have too much to do with that, as you might imagine. And no, I wasn't hostile to it, but I mean, I didn't know. I was not effective in that area. And the one thing I want to say is, though, has to do a little bit, I was thinking when you were talking about institutions, the way in which I still feel this in a way, that schools of architecture waste their production to a certain extent. And although there is a lot of annual books published by schools of architecture, they are, in many cases, extremely disturbing because they are, computer drawings and digital material that has been put very rapidly into a book. And there is a very disturbing feeling that I have anyway, that of opening these books and not being able to tell one project from the next or get any information out of it at all because it's all sort of blurred in a way. Digitally blurred, I think I could say. And then they also all look like each other. And
Well, could say that about line squares.
yeah, okay. But I think that, I think that I just want to, right, well, this question of resistance, which has been raised a number of times, I mean, I think that maybe it's not such a useful term in itself, and that it might be better to talk about strategy, actually, or about strategies, in fact. I mean, since we seem, I mean, and quite rightly that you've urged us to address the emerging generation and, and to give them just the word resistance, I don't think is very helpful, but to give the word strategy might be more productive, and so that, yes, I mean, for example, I have obviously sort of played around with the word resistance because in 1983, this Towards a Critical Regionalism has the subtitle 6 Points for an Architecture of Resistance. I mean, I'm not disclaiming that, but I think that this question of strategy, and I suppose that coming back to the question of schools not looking after their own production carefully enough, I mean, I'm not against, of course, digital. It's inescapable, the digital. But something recently happened in Columbia, which is that suddenly the students started to produce the most exquisite drawings, the most exquisite digital drawings that are almost like watercolor renderings, but not very, very precise and also combined with very intense spatial imagination and also organizational, structural imagination. And I looked at these drawings. This is an experience I had last semester, and I thought, where is it coming from? You can say it's coming from the very large tutorial stuff, but I also think it's coming from underneath. I think that schools do sometimes change from underneath, And but what concerns me at this moment, which relates a little bit to my thing about wastage and also to your challenge to do with institutions, and I think one could say schools of architecture are institutions, that it is a real test, I think, for the present is what exactly is Columbia going to do with these drawings now with regard to the next annual publication, Because if it sort of doesn't put them into a publication that is very, very precise, and beautiful, aesthetic, somehow it will also be disposable digital paper, I mean, I think what bothers me is this kind of high-speed productions that schools have done as records of their work, but it has a feeling of being disposable. It's like all disposable. I think that would be a strategy I wouldn't advise. And I think the question of what are effective strategies. I mean, I'm someone who still thinks that though I know there are problems that with the term landscape urbanism, nonetheless I do think landscape urbanism probably is an effective strategy for intervention, because it seems to me this question of intervention is what is the option to us. We're not going to, well, it's unlikely we're going to repeat the Chinese thing of designing cities or moving 350 million people from the countryside into cities in the next 10 years. It's very unlikely it's going to happen in this country. So in a way, what's open to the schools and then to the profession is the possibility of intervention. And then what are the strategies of intervention? I mean, I think that, so rather than the word resistance, I think the word strategy is something that could be more productive.
But it's interesting, in terms of strategy, the strategy obviously has to be related to a condition or a context, right?
Yeah.
And if you look at the condition or the context, which has been described today for case, which is, Peter, when we saw the photograph of Rockefeller in the Museum of Modern Art, looking at the products of these groups, we're saying that, what?
And Lindsay.
Yeah, we're saying, that could never happen today. The reason he was there and the reason Lindsay was there was because of the Harlem riots of 1964, the year before. The whole city erupted, right? And, then Detroit and so on and so forth. Now, the cities are still erupting. There are still conditions in the cities which are absolutely horrific and that people are resisting against, and that the social media allows for even greater and broader resistance, so that something that happens in one city can lead to a huge protest in another city. So that now the conditions, I think, in terms of, one, the urban conditions, the conditions of housing, the conditions of society are magnified, but they haven't changed in relationship to the individual citizen. And secondly, from case, they are magnified in relationship to the condition of architecture because of the massive, if you like, pluralism that's emerged to a certain extent without a kind of ethics or a moral or a theoretical construct that gives authority to one iteration of, as opposed to another, so that we still have the kind of things that are so easily developed into binuclear, form and function, aesthetic art and social need. So in that sense, there's a need for case, a need for the construction of a conversation that somehow cuts through, en diagonale, as they used to say in Paris, in such a way that we're not actually saying that the fabrication of a space with a kind of sense of spatial and formal organization and the provision of housing and the economics of capital investment and the policing of a city and the politics of populism and the questions of how you deal with a politics which is a media politics as opposed to a voting politics. All these questions are hugely magnified, but the conditions that brought case into existence, that where people like Goodman wanted to go into the streets, and people like Peter wanted to go into the formal structure of architecture itself, these conditions are still the same. And so I don't see why, I think there should be those kinds of conversations. I don't know how they could occur, but I think there are more media for them to occur and more possibilities for them to occur in terms of strategy than there were open to case members. So why not? Let's be optimistic.
Well, I'm not arguing that.
No, I know you're not.
Why not? Yes.
I'm not arguing against you. I'm actually arguing for you.
No. I mean, the only thing, what is disturbing is that, because at a certain point you talked about the reaction of power to riots,
Right.
But you have this uneasy feeling that power has gotten inured to this.
Yes.
And we'll just, all right, another one, okay, we'll snuff it out, and then there'll be another one. But we are not really interested. I mean, the maldistribution of wealth is much worse.
Yeah.
than
That's
the
why I said the
Hippocrates case.
conditions are exacerbated
much
to
worse.
a huge degree.
Yeah.
I don't know exactly how to make the comparisons about the opportunities today and the ones that were available at the time the case was created and the Institute. But, Sylvia, I think you rightly were uncomfortable about the amount of nostalgia that has been in the room, and that we should move on to and questions. And you talked about the away from architect to the institution, and I think there was something about whether there are voids that could be filled and so on. So I want to go back and reflect a little bit about the situation that Peter and some of us found. I mean, when Peter and Michael and I were at Columbia together, they were in the architecture school, so they were the ones who had the critical assessments. But they felt that Columbia, even though they were there, they didn't feel it was a very good school. They had a great respect for Percival Goodman, and it didn't go much beyond that. And other architecture schools in New York didn't have any meaning to us either. I at least still had a great respect for COM at Philadelphia, and they probably did too. But we had, somehow Cambridge, because it's both Harvard and MIT, it was clearly a place of advanced education, but we heard the thoughts about Gropius. And in New York, what museum was showing architecture? The Museum of Modern Art was not very active then, and there weren't others that were going to do it. Publication. When Peter wanted to get a book out, he goes to the small bookshop on the east side and convinces Braziller to publish a book. Yeah. Whitmore, sorry. Yeah, certainly. We talked about the void of architectural culture in New York in those days. And I mean, it was across the country too. But the New York, in some ways, well, we thought maybe there was something in Philadelphia, maybe there was something in Cambridge, but New York was a void. So it's difficult to talk about Peter because you immediately an individual, and and there's a certain nostalgia, but it's fantastic that after he left or had to leave Princeton, that he sort of pulled himself up and made connections in New York and made them start to work, made Drexler do something, got the New York New Cities exhibition going, which then engaged other people, got other people energized, got Case going, got people energized, made connections. I started at HDC here and got a good deal of the conviction about our own program was that many members of Case were telling other people that there's a really good program. Yeah, that's the place to go. It was a reinforcing thing. It was building an institution, but it was coming out of these personal connections. And then, so Peter got the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies created, and how it is, how it all spins off. But today, you've got several institutions that are interested in architecture in New York City. You've got a range of publishers there. MIT Press was a great architectural publisher at that time. In fact, we used MIT Press to get some of these things going. Now it doesn't even say, it has some publication, but it doesn't even represent itself at book fairs anymore as being an architectural publisher. This one has faded, and New York has just come to be the dominant figure in publishing, exhibition, education, the whole thing. So you can't say Peter did the whole thing, but I don't think it would have happened without him.
Okay.
Well, we're going to maybe turn it, I'm supposed to now turn it over to the audience for any questions, and while people are thinking of something to ask, maybe I'll just conclude by saying that I think one of the most interesting things that's happening today is the proliferation of small centers of activity all over the place. Lots of people doing publications, lots of people doing platforms, lots of people doing all kinds of things. I think the field is very active. And I think that one of the models that it takes from Case is not the content of the conversation at all, but rather that if you want to change the conversation, you have to invent new platforms for it. So that does seem to me to be incredibly important. It's the most productive thing, the least centralized thing, the most technologically savvy thing, maybe the most optimistic thing. Also the most scary thing because it's a form of instrumentation, in fact, without intrinsic content. So you have to sort of rely on the generosity and intelligence of the people around you that they will fill it with good content and maybe universities teach us not to be so confident in our colleagues, but maybe that's something that we can change. But at any rate, I think that it, you know, there's a kind of chutzpah model, I suppose, in the just inventing your own platform to get the ideas that are important to you across, and I think that that still serves as a very powerful model for emerging generations. Now, that sounded very final, but it wasn't. Should it be final, or do you want to have questions? It should be final. You're shaking your head.
On optimism, Sylvia, but I think we have to just always keep in mind, what those ideas are. I mean, it's one thing about, you know.
Peter has to leave,
Some of the air has been sucked out of the room, obviously, with
Now you can say what you really
think. But I just, as far as optimism, just to put a slight damper on the optimism, I just think we have to kind of always keep in mind what those ideas are. I mean, it's not just a matter of putting ideas out and creating new platforms. Maybe it wasn't, I just want to clarify what I was trying to suggest about this trend, this evolution that takes place from the 60s into the 70s by saying that I think very much it's possible to read the 70s as a backlash against the 60s, or I'm certainly not the first to say that, but that the frustration, the problem, the urban crisis narrative, urban crisis phenomenon that's been referred to here, triggered a reaction, and that reaction took form by the early 70s as something else. So I think just, you know, new platforms for the sake of new platforms is certainly not the issue. The issue is what are the, you know, what's really urgent, what's really pressing, what has to be addressed by the culture of architecture in any of its forms, and how an organization is positioning itself in relation to those issues. I mean, these are crucial issues, strategic issues, if you like, but ones that, I mean, just more and more platforms is not a good thing by itself.
Joan, we've got like 60 seconds left. I'm really going to shoot myself if we just end with "it's not a good thing." I would again. I mean, just to say, I think I was trying to be very careful to say that I don't know what these ideas are, but rather to look back at this period, which has been incredibly interesting over the course of the day. Lots of good ideas, lots of bad ideas that we saw being articulated. But I think it was a really interesting moment in which, in fact, the shift seemed to be away from only focusing on ideas and their virgin pristineness, and thinking about ideas, whatever they were, in relation to how they get disseminated, how they get produced, how they get funded, and so forth. And taking control of the infrastructure of ideas seems to be really where I, in fact, feel the most optimistic, because students seem pretty savvy about that. So, bonne chance.